He was the most feared general in America, a man who had beaten every army the North could send against him. His soldiers believed he could not be beaten, and for 2 years he had proved them right. In the summer of 1863, he marched north to end the war in a single crushing blow. On a low ridge in Pennsylvania, he ordered 12,000 men across an open mile of fire. In half an hour, half of them were dead or broken, and the charge collapsed against the guns. This is the story of the losing side. To understand how the finest army in the South destroyed itself, you must begin with the man who led it. Robert E. Lee was a gray-haired Virginian who had turned down command of the Union Army to follow his home state. He took a battered, half-starved army and made it the most dangerous fighting force on the continent. Time after time, he beat back larger, better supplied northern armies with speed and sheer audacity. At Fredericksburg, his men cut down wave after wave of attackers on an open slope below their guns. His soldiers adored him, called him simply Marse Robert, and believed that he could not lose. That belief, shared by Lee himself, was about to lead them all to catastrophe. In the spring of 1863, Lee won his most brilliant victory at Chancellorsville. Outnumbered 2-1, he split his army in the face of the enemy and shattered them. But the triumph cost him his finest lieutenant, Stonewall Jackson, shot down by his own men in the dark. Jackson had been the sword arm of the army, and Lee said he had lost his right hand. Yet, the victory convinced Lee that his men could do anything he asked of them. He resolved to carry the war north, invade Pennsylvania, and force the Union to make peace. It was a bold gamble to win the whole war in a single campaign on northern soil. A great victory in the North, he believed, might break the enemy's will to keep fighting. In June, his army crossed into Pennsylvania, marching through a rich and untouched countryside. But Lee was moving half-blind, for his cavalry had ridden off and left him without eyes. He did not know that the entire Union army was closing on him faster than he thought. The two armies collided almost by accident at a small crossroads town called Gettysburg. On the first day, the Confederates drove the outnumbered Union troops back through the streets. It looked like another great victory in the making for Lee and his men. But the beaten Northerners fell back onto a chain of high ground, just south of the town. There they dug in along the ridges and hills and waited for their whole army to arrive. By the second day, the Union held a strong line along Cemetery Ridge and the Rocky Hills. Lee's most trusted commander, General Longstreet, urged him not to attack such powerful ground. He begged Lee to swing around the enemy and fight on ground of their own choosing. But Lee's blood was up, and he was certain his invincible army could break the line. "The enemy is there," he said, "and I am going to strike him." On the second day, his men stormed the heights in savage, blood-soaked attacks. They fought through wheat fields and boulders at places that became legend, like Little Round Top. The assaults came close, agonizingly close, but everywhere along the ridge the Union line held. By nightfall, thousands lay dead and wounded, and Lee had gained almost nothing at all. Any other general might have broken off and gone to look for a better battlefield. But Lee had come north to win, and he would not turn back now. If the fall of a great commander moves you, take 1 second to subscribe and stand with the losing side. On the third day, Lee made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He would hurl one massive assault straight at the very center of the Union line. Longstreet was horrified and told him no 15,000 men alive could take that position. But Lee had made up his mind, and the order stood. First, 150 guns opened the greatest cannonade ever heard on the continent. For nearly 2 hours, the two sides hammered each other in a deafening artillery duel. Then the guns fell silent, and 12,000 men stepped out of the woods into the open. Rank upon rank, their banners flying, they began the long march across a mile of open field. It was a magnificent and terrible sight, and it is remembered as Pickett's charge. As they came on, the Union guns tore great holes straight through their perfect lines. Cannon fire, and then close musketry, cut the grey ranks down by the hundreds. A few hundred men reached the stone wall and surged over it in one last desperate rush. For a single moment, the Confederacy touched the crest of the ridge, and victory seemed near. Then the counterattack swept them away, and the whole charge dissolved into a bleeding wreck. In little more than half an hour, over half of the attackers were dead, wounded, or captured. The shattered survivors streamed back across the field they had crossed with such pride. Lee rode out among them, alone, to face the ruin of his grandest and last attack. "It is all my fault," he told them, again and again. "This has been my fight." He begged the broken men to reform, expecting a counterattack that, mercifully, never came. The high-water mark of the Confederacy had risen and broken in a single afternoon. That night, Lee's great gamble lay dead in the trampled wheat fields of Pennsylvania. The Invincible Army had at last been beaten, undone by its own commander's certainty. The next day, the two exhausted armies stared at each other across the corpse-strewn ground. Then, in a driving rain, Lee began the long and grinding retreat back toward Virginia. The wounded filled a wagon train 17 miles long, groaning over every rut in the road. Lee had lost a third of his army, the finest soldiers the South could never replace. He offered his resignation to his president, taking the blame for the disaster upon himself. It was refused, for there was simply no one else who could take his place. But the war had changed, and everyone who could see clearly already knew it. Never again would Lee's army be strong enough to invade the North. From Gettysburg on, the Confederacy would do little but slowly retreat and bleed. For 2 more years, Lee fought on, brilliant and stubborn, against ever-lengthening odds. The North, with its vast numbers and endless factories, closed in from every side. His ragged army was ground down, starved out, and at last surrounded in Virginia. In the spring of 1865, at a quiet village called Appomattox, Lee surrendered. He rode to give up his sword in his finest uniform, beaten in war, but unbowed in bearing. The most feared army in America had finally come to its end. Lee had been the greatest soldier of his war, and it had saved neither him nor his cause. He had won victories that will be studied for as long as men study war at all. Yet all his genius had served a doomed rebellion built to keep other men in chains. At Gettysburg, the very boldness that had made him great finally destroyed his army. He had asked 12,000 men to do the impossible, and they went because he asked. Half of them never came back, and Lee knew that the fault was his alone. He carried that weight in silence through the few quiet years that were left to him. The charge that failed became the moment the tide of the entire war turned. Mas Robert, the man who could not be beaten, had in the end beaten himself, and the army that worshipped him walked at his word into the guns and died. That, in the end, was the tragedy of Robert E., Lee at Gettysburg. This has been the story of the losing side,